Mark values are important elements in a composition. They can contain the edges of a piece or anchor the center. They can emphasize lost edges or provide a foil for a delicate subject. You can create pattern and repetition or a staccato punctuation, and you can ground a minimalist aesthetic. Hi, I'm Tanya Davis, and I'm going to give you a demo today on the occasion of Florida Watercolor Society's 50th annual exhibition and this year virtual convention. I'm a professional artist since 1989. You can check out my resume on my website, TanyaDavisWatercolors.com, and Facebook is also Tanya Davis Watercolors. So you can put a face with an image, print it out. The painting that I got in this year's show, I was very excited to be accepted by our wonderful juror. So normally it would take me way too long to actually do a painting for a demo, and I was going to do some swatches, but since we're recording videos, we can use the modern technology and editing features, and we'll see how much we can get done. I want to start by talking about permanence though, which is slightly off topic, but I know the audience has a wide range of experience and education in arts. I was not taught about light fastness in college, and I found out the hard way, so I have this little plein air sketch to show you from 1981. You can see that I matted over it. It hung on the wall for 3 years. Then it was in the closet for maybe 7 before I unframed it. We were moving overseas and I was getting rid of extra glass that could break. And I was shocked when I unframed it, obviously. Went right to my toolbox full of paints to check out what happened. It was alizarin crimson, it was professional grade, and it was clearly labeled fugitive, which I've never read because the print's so tiny. So the moral of the story is check your paints. Professional grade does not guarantee permanence. If you buy them in person, turn the tube over. Category 1 is excellent, Category 2 is very good. 3 and 4 is moderate and fugitive. I don't use anything that's moderate and fugitive, having learned my lesson. If you shop online, Cheap Joe's has an information tab you can click, and Dick Blick's also has a pigment info tab that you can click. So I will put up a screen of the colors on my palette, the frequently used and the occasionally used. I tend to pick a warm and a blue of each, of the primaries and the secondaries, and I'll try to call them out as I use them as we go through. I also want to talk about color theory very briefly, just to give you a background of how I make these decisions. The color wheel that we were all taught was described first by Sir Isaac Newton. He was talking about prisms and light and optics. It has almost nothing to do with mixing paint. It's pretty useless in my opinion. A couple hundred years later, Philip Otto Runge came up with the model color sphere. And this is a printout from Wikimedia Commons. I'll put that screen up also. But imagine, if you will, a sphere, a globe, just like the Earth, with a North Pole and a South Pole, with longitude and latitude and an equator and layers. So there's a core in the middle. So if you drilled a core sample from the North Pole white through the Black Pole south, pulled it out, you'd have a grayscale with perfect neutral 50% in the middle, a gray not tinged with any particular color. Isaac Newton's color wheel wraps like a belt around the equator. If you scraped with a carrot scraper from white through red to black, you'd have a scale of all the reds, all the tints and shades of red, of that particular red. If you drilled straight through from red to green, you'd have a complementary color scale, red with 10% green, and so on. Perfect mud in the middle, and then green with 10% red. If you took it off layer by layer, at each layer down you go, all the colors in that new layer are equally adulterated, modified, neutralized by their complement. So everything on the outer surface is very pure, kindergarten colors, very happy, pure colors. And you get more and more sophisticated and modified, neutralized the deeper you go. So the moral of the story is you can't get every red you want by only using reds, right? You need to use something from the other side of the globe to pull that red into these neutralized, modified reds that would be deeper down. You can do it by something opposite, directly opposite. It doesn't have to be, mathematically accurate, but you can also make triads. So if you have things on 3 equidistant points around this globe, if you mix them together, you get neutral in the middle. If you just modify a dash of something, so if you're making a red, blue, yellow triad with blue with maybe just a dash of yellow, a dash of red, you're going to pull that blue into the grays by neutralizing it up just a little bit. So everybody has their own preference and taste, and my preference and taste in my color palette in my final paintings tends to be slightly modified colors, maybe like 1 layer down on that globe. I know artists that use just all really vibrant, pure, unmodified colors, and I've known artists that like to live so deep in that globe that everything looks like a sepia tint. It's just their preference. So I'm going to be working on a painting. You'll see bits and pieces of it as I go, because I'll probably have to edit or fast forward. I started with this photo. I take lots and lots of photos. I didn't want to do the whole thing. This fish caught my eye. So what I like about this guy, I like the elegance of the shape as he's turning, and I like these radial ripples. I like the contrast, and I thought it would be a good example of how I work when I'm doing the koi. I don't just paint koi, but that's what tends to get in shows. I've entered still life in a koi, and seems like jurors like the koi, so there you go, and I'm the koi lady. I don't do a lot of masking fluid. I probably won't do, but maybe just 1 dot on this one. When I do it, I only do dots. I don't like to cover large areas. I see it because I use a 4H and a 2H pencil. I'm drawing pretty light. The areas, the lines where I know I have a pretty hard edge, I've done a firmer pencil line, not firm enough to leave a groove in the paper. I'm working on 300-pound cold press. So I guess we get started. I could probably talk a lot more. Don't shake masking fluid. I just stir it with the end of paintbrush. Haven't used it in a while. I've been gardening all summer, doing a backyard makeover project, so I actually cleaned my palette off for you. That's like a once-a-year happening for me. I'm rinsing it out really good and getting rid of the messy old paint. So this is an old paintbrush that I only use for this, and it's kind of rubberized on the end from the residual. And there's only a couple of spots that are going to stay pure white on this particular painting. I often have a lot more, but I wanted to keep this a little bit simple. So there's one little bubble right here, and I just touch the paper, barely, and that's it. So we'll let that dry for just a minute and talk to you about the palette. I don't do much to clean off the brush when that's done. I just kind of rub off some of the excess. It's a little bit like rubber cement, if you're old enough like me to remember using rubber cement. Kind of twist it and scrape it with my fingernail till it's got a little bit of a point. I don't like to cover large areas with masking fluid because it bothers my eyes seeing that on there, for one thing. For another, the paper stays dry underneath the masking fluid, and as you're painting over it, the paper around that area is wet, obviously. It kind of swells. You may not notice it really much to the naked eye, but it does. And because watercolor paper has sizing on it, the pigment sits in a little bit of a film, and that pigment will swim down and kind of settle right along the edge of that masking fluid line and give you a little bit of a hard line there that's hard to get rid of later. And the purpose of covering that white spot in the first place is it's one of those highlights, and you don't want it darker right around the edge of a highlight. Highlights tend to kind of have a pinkish, almost halo around them. The other thing I could say is that when I'm getting ready to paint, and usually I have dried lumps of paint on my palette, we all do, right? If you just dip your brush in water and rub on that dried lump of paint, you're just breaking bristles off. So I tend to, and this is all fresh paint, so I don't really need to do this right now, but I tend to just put, I'll do it anyway, won't hurt anything, a little dribble of water in each well, and let those old dried lumps of paint steep and soften up a little bit. You'll save your brush, make life a little bit easier for you, makes your paint last longer. If I know I'm going to be doing painting with a lot of red or particular color, I'll go ahead and give myself fresh paint. When I'm getting ready to do a large area, so I have 4 sections on my palette, one's occupied, go ahead and give myself a pretty good amount of water to start with there. Actually, I need a couple of spots. I'm going to make a triad of kind of a blue-gray silvery color for the bulk of the background, and I'm going to drop some yellow in and let it just flow and blend. This will be my first foundation layer. I work from light to dark to medium. And I know a lot of watercolor teachers tell you to work light to dark, and the problem with that for me is you really have to have the artistic equivalent of perfect pitch to do that. If I asked you to do a grayscale, just blind, just out of nowhere, start with white and give me 10%, give me 20%, right on up. It's really hard to be good enough to guess where 30 or 40% is, and because we tend to be a little bit cautious with watercolor, you can't take it back. I found that working light to dark, I was more timid and hesitant, and I never really achieved good darks and good middle values. My paintings came out fairly pale. So I found that if early on in my composition, I go ahead and do a dark area, especially if it's a discrete area, defined lines around it. It's going to be the darkest area. I put that in second. And then I'm a lot bolder with my middle values. So let me go ahead and mix up, stand up, I don't know if you'll still, yeah, kind of. Mix up a blue-gray. I keep extra swatches of paint around, or paper, sorry, of paper around to test my colors on. So this is a cerulean blue, and I'm gonna throw in some permanent rose, mix a little bit purpley. I use the paper towel here to tip off my brush. When you load your brush, it holds paint because of capillary action, and if you overload your brush, the minute you touch the paper, you'll have like this mound of water. I don't know if you could see that, but I know you all have seen that on your own. So if instead you just tip the brush off when you touch the paper, you can control what you're doing. And I also then can also wipe off excess paint on the paper towel, and it keeps my water a little bit cleaner as I go. So I've got cerulean blue, I've got some permanent rose, and I'm going to throw in some Naples yellow. All of the colors I'm using are transparent. Some of them are a little bit more opaque than others. They're still technically transparent, but I just consider them slightly pasty. So it's a pretty nice blue-gray, maybe a little bit more lavenderish. All right, so I'm happy with that. And now I want to have some yellow on hand. So this blue-gray can underline everything on the painting except where I'm saving the white with masking fluid, and another spot here that I'm saving white. I'm just going to paint around that. Everything else can be underlined by the blue, except the yellow. Yellow is so easily modified. So I'm going to take some cadmium lemon and a little bit of Naples, warm it up just a little bit. It's pale, but I don't want to go too far. It's a very delicate painting, very delicate image that I'm trying to create. And the fish is almost abstract. It's almost invisible in this. The black areas are very dominant and the fish is very subtle. So the next thing I do is turn the paper over and wet the back. When watercolor paper is wet, it swells buckles. When it's dry, it doesn't. So you get buckling when one side is very wet and the other side isn't. When I'm doing a large wash over a big area, then just go ahead and get the back wet. It doesn't really matter if it slops anywhere and it's laying on gator board, so that can get wet. And the only trick to that when you're done painting is you want to kind of dry any puddles that are around, because it'll whip back on and create a bloom on the edge. So that's good and wet. Sometimes I'll start by wetting an area, just generally to let the paint flow and bleed a little bit better into each other, into other colors. So I'm not particularly fussed about whether the yellow goes off into the water area. It'll blend okay. And anyway, sometimes things really do have a halo. When you're exploring the world, try it up a little bit already. When you're exploring the world with your fingers, everything has an edge, right? If you're just walking around feeling things, everything has an edge. But when you're looking, you're dealing with the light, and light glances off and bounces around. So you don't always see an edge. Half the trick of painting realistically is turning off what you expect to see. And there's that little white area that I'm going to paint around. I don't have to be real precise because it's in the middle of a field of black, or what we're going to call black, but it's not true black. Anyway, things will have lost edges or halos around. So I could have wet the whole piece of paper, but I think I'm working quick enough to keep the leading edge wet, so I'm not going to worry too much about doing that. I've torn my paper down. This started out as a regular full sheet of watercolor paper, 22 by 30. I like to create a fake decal edge. My work tends to be so precise that people used to say, oh, is it a photograph? So I found that if I show that decal edge, I don't get that comment as much. I mean, it's a compliment, but it's a painting, it's not a photo. I want it to look like a painting. I'm just going over that masking fluid dot. The puddle dries as you go, so just keep adding water to it. So there we are, and you can see that the yellow did just bleed past. I'm going to wipe those edges just underneath. There's some down here. I'm not big on blow dryers, but I know a lot of people use them. I don't know, I don't find them necessary. So I've got this brush, I've rinsed it off, and it's just damp. And there's areas that the fish is very white, and I want to pull some of that blue back out. So because brushes work by capillary action, it's just actually kind of sucking a little bit of the paint up off. It's pretty subtle. I don't know if it's going to show up on the video. We'll see. And this won't be the final background color anyway. There will be a little bit darker blues and grays added. Okay. All right, I wanted to give you a close-up of mixing the color on the palette. When you're mixing your color, you're looking at it through a mound of water, and the pigment doesn't really dissolve per se like salt dissolves in the water. It's tiny little sediments floating around. And as you're looking through the depth of that puddle, you're looking through a lot of layers of those little bits of pigment swimming around. So you think it might look, maybe you think it looks dark enough, and then you spread it out on your painting, and it's not nearly as dark as you thought it was, because now you're not looking through all those layers, you've spread it flat. So this is Payne's Gray, and this is Permanent Magenta. And that was Cat Orange. It's kind of an olive green color, and back to Payne's Gray. So we've got a lot more pigment in there, but it's still filling in pretty quickly when I streak my brush through. You can't put watercolor paint on straight. It's got too much gum arabic. It's not meant to be applied like acrylic, but just see how thick you can get it on your palette. So when I drag my brush through, you see it takes a second or two to fill back in. And the thicker you get that pigment, the longer it takes to fill back in. Let's throw some permanent rose in there. It's getting darker. So drag my brush through, and you almost have white palette as it slowly closes in. So that's a pretty dark color for a first foundation layer of a dark area. And do the same thing with the second layer, and go slow with that. But think about how much pigment you're putting in your puddle. It helps if you can just drag your brush through, then you know you've got a good dense color. All right, so when I'm getting ready to paint more than just a big background wash like that, I tend to give myself some little puddles. One of the hardest things as a beginning artist was knowing how to mix colors, and then while struggling with that, ending up with the hugest pile of color. When you finally get it just right, you've got a puddle 3 inches across when you need the tiniest little mark on your painting. So by giving myself these little droplets all around, I think you can see that maybe. It gives me starter puddles. I can merge them easily. I can pull a little water from another puddle as the color that I'm working in maybe starts to dry out a little bit. You can see that I turn my paper. When I'm going to be painting a curve like that, I want to be ergonomic with the arc of my elbow and wrist. If you're going to paint like the rim of a teacup, instead of trying to paint and move your whole arm, if you can brace your elbow and let your ergonomics work with you, let your mechanics work with you. Keep a paper towel to rest my wrist on, just to keep body oils off the paper. And you can see that the paper is perfectly flat with no buckling because I did wet the back. As I go with smaller washes and smaller areas, it's going to puff up and bow a little bit, mound up in certain areas. When I'm done, I will let it dry for a day, and then I will turn it over and sponge the back, very carefully keeping it away from the edge so it doesn't wick around. I'll lay a piece of acid-free cardboard on top and stack books on it for 48 hours minimum, depending on how badly warped it was. So to start, I'm going to start right in with the darkest darks, which was the topic that I got some inquiries and interest on. I usually start with a Payne's Gray, which is actually black and ultramarine blue already pre-mixed for you. It's a lovely deep blue color. Get it pretty dark. And much like the blue-gray, I like to use a triad. I can push this, instead of making it like a plain black, I can push it to more of a green black, brown black, a purple black. And this one, because the yellow fish and the silver blue-gray water, I'm going to lean towards a purpley black. So this is Permanent Magenta. It's the color that I replaced alizarin crimson with because it is light fast. So now I have kind of a deep, beautiful purple. And I can take the purple down just a step with some cad orange, modifying that purple with something that's close to its complement. You can see it's closer to black. This is ultramarine violet. So that's as good a place as any to start. It's not black. It's the first coat, and it's probably going to look a little blotchy to you when I'm doing a large area. All right, so let's go. So I know it's hard to see exactly what the paintbrush is doing when it's contacting the paper. A lot of my koi paintings have tropical foliage like palm fronds and such, and I wanted to show you how I get those little points. And the trick is that you let the point lay first in that point and drag it back from the point. So just the very edge, just very fine line, and then drag it back. And after it's dry, a little bit dry, I can rinse the brush and drag those little feathers out a little bit further, or drag them out with more interesting colors than this. This is Payne's Gray, Permanent Magenta, Cad Orange, maybe a little Burnt Sienna, I don't know. So there you go. And then I will wipe the brush in the towel, rinse the brush, it's dry for just a second. I'm going to turn the paper the other way. And just carefully drag that out a little bit. Another rinse and blot. And you can put a little color on there if you want as you're doing that. So that's it. To make a starburst, it's the same process except in reverse. You'd be painting the wedges between the starburst. And then, as usual, I would run a little bead around the edge just to soften a little bead of color. So that's the close-up view. So I'm putting a little water in the wells, Yesterday it was fresh paint, today it's not. So this will help it soften up a little bit and save my brush. Just a couple of drops in each well. And maybe this would be a good time to go ahead and name the colors. I've put a slide up with a list of the colors that I'm using. I'm giving myself starter puddles there for pulling in as I mix color. All right, so from here we have raw umber, burnt sienna, cad lemon, cad yellow deep, yellow ochre, Naples yellow, cad orange, cad scarlet, cad red deep, permanent rose, cobalt violet, permanent magenta, ultramarine violet, Payne's gray, ultramarine blue, Windsor blue, green shade, cerulean blue, cobalt turquoise, phthalo yellow green, olive green, and cobalt green. So as I said, no, my brush wasn't very clean. As I said yesterday about a warm and a cool, for example, this Windsor blue is kind of a warm blue. It's got a lot of yellow in it. And the ultramarine blue, I would say, is cool. It's more of a middle blue. So if you're going to make green using blue and yellow, then you're going to have a lot better luck with a Windsor blue and a cad lemon. It makes a beautiful green. But if you used ultramarine and, say, cad yellow deep, it's not a very clear green. I mean, maybe it's what you want, but just knowing that your colors are warm and cool, because a color is not by nature intrinsically warm, only when compared to something else. All right, so I'm going to clean my palette up and then get started. Today's goal is to add the middle values here in the water and firm up the fish a little bit. I want to emphasize this line and the eye, because there's only a few clues that I'm giving the viewer that it's a fish, but I want it to be just the right amount of clues. Once I finish that step, then I'll go back to the darks. You can see it's a little blotchy, which is fine as a preliminary coat. So I'll go back to the darks and beef those up, and I may modulate them from maybe moving from a greenish black to a more purple black as I go. And in the kind of the last step is to work on those edges. I don't like to leave a hard edge like that. I will add a strip of color all around to soften it. And I'm planning in this area to add a yellow green on one side and a magenta on the other side all through. And it'll be pretty subtle, but it's a little unexpected pop of color and to soften that edge. Okay, so let me get started. Alright, so you can see that the paper is a little bit buckled from the work I did yesterday. It was flat when I put the initial wash down, and then as I did this work it started to curve a little bit, and that's fine. And I'm going to work on adding some definition to the water, a little bit of blue, gray, purpley color. So again, I'll go with a bit of a triad, a bit of a cerulean blue, there's ultramarine blue, and that's just way too blue. So I want to pull it into the color sphere a little bit. Won't take much. This is cad scarlet. And it's kind of a lavendery color, maybe a little bit more muted. And this is cad orange. So still blue, but you can't really tell whether it's like a greenish blue maybe. And I'll probably vary it up as I go, starting with that puddle and adding some other colors as I go along. And again, I like to keep a little bit of a drape on the paper as I work and turn the painting as I'm working. fresh water. And again, giving myself a little bit of starter petals. Okay, the center area here I want to come off a little less blue, a little more muted. It's sort of picking up some yellow from the fish. So the gray I'm going to make for this area is going to be a little warmer. Starting with a cerulean blue, going with Naples yellow, dash of permanent rose, and then yellow ochre. Maybe a little bit more. I'm about ready to do another layer on the dark. So I've worked light to dark to middle. Now I'm going to go back to dark, a little bit darker. It's going to completely change the look of the painting once that dark is firmed up a little bit. Okay. Well, I forgot to call out the colors as I made the puddles. So this first puddle is one of two darks I'm making for the second wash. This is going to be the green black. It starts with Payne's Gray and Burnt Sienna and Cad Orange. Later I add Olive Green and Cad Scarlet. Sometimes I just use the puddles that are already there. It provides a little bit of cohesion to a painting if you just morph an existing puddle to the next color that you're going to use. It just kind of shows through in a subtle sort of way that the colors are all related. So I start with the green. Now I'm making the purple dark. I'm using Payne's Gray and Permanent Magenta. So I'm going to put these layers on top of the existing dark. You can see I get the puddle pretty color rich. You could sort of drag your paintbrush through it and leave a streak, as you can see as I swirl the paint. I don't have to get super close to the edge on the darks because later I'm going to go back with a wet color and drag a color along the edge anyway to help blur the edges and add a little pop of color. So in this clip, I'm connecting some of the dark ripples with a light gray, and this just helps to emphasize the shininess and the highlights between the ripples and kind of blend those edges. While the brush is damp, it also softens the hard edge left from the 2 layers of the dark wash. So it's just a triad again of cerulean blue and Naples yellow and permanent rose, maybe some other colors mixed in, just kind of a muddy blue-gray. And the dark sort of reactivates along the edge there, even though it's been dry for a while, a couple of hours probably at this point. But going over it with a damp brush, a little color reactivates that edge, so the new color you add kind of mixes with the dark right there at the edge. All right, well, I think this is the final push. I'm going to put some pops of color along those dark ripples, and may put another wash on the silvery blue gray background of the water. Okay. At this point, I'm going to bring some more value to the area of water above the fish, darken it up just a little bit. I'm using the existing puddles, what's left of them. I'm going to make another triad, again with the cerulean blue, and this time I'll use cobalt violet with it, and a little Naples yellow. So you see it pushes green, and then I bring it back into the more purple range. It's still a gray, just a silvery gray. So add the color, and then taper it off with water so that it blends in. It does go over the edge of the dark, which is pretty dry at this point, but it softens it. Well, sometimes the hardest thing to know is when to quit. I'm going to stop right there. Thank you for watching and tuning into Florida Watercolor Society's 50th Annual Convention. All right, Tanya Davis, and you can find more about me on TanyaDavisWatercolors.com. Thanks.